What's going on, guys? Welcome back to the channel. Welcome if it's your first time here. When I was in school, I excelled at history. Math, not so much, but history, I definitely excelled at history and got really good grades in those topics. I liked history so much that I would actually go down to the school library and check out books on my own. The Vietnam War, the Korean War, the Civil War, the Great Depression, the Native American tribes that lived in my area. Everything to do with history and the past, I was extremely interested in learning more about. And because of that interest, it became easy to learn and to absorb and retain what I had learned. And you might be asking what this has to do with prepping. If you look at it strategically, for example, if you take into account the Native American tribes tribe that lived in your area, that was predominant in your area, and you look at that tribe and you do research into that tribe and how they survived, how they lived, and the things they done to stay alive, and that will help you to better plan your preps and to actually use some of those techniques to increase your own survival. For example, what did they plant? How did they plant those crops? How did they harvest those crops? How did they preserve those crops? It was done in the past in your local area, so it can be done again. And perhaps, and most likely, a lot of those crops are still being grown in your area. And that will help you find out what grows best in your area throughout history. So you'll know what seeds to store, what plants to grow, what to learn more about. And like I said, you need to also learn how they harvested and preserved. What game animals did they hunt, mostly? How did they hunt those animals? What hunting techniques did they use? How did they preserve that meat? How did they use those hides? How did they use everything from the animal? And how can you implement that in your own survival plans? Another thing, for example, what plants did they forage for and harvest? And how did they harvest those? How did they preserve those? And how did they use those plants? How did they heal themselves? How did they stay healthy? What plants are native in your area that the Native Americans actually used to good effect to keep themselves healthy? How did they treat common everyday illnesses like, the common cold and things like that? What did they use? How did they use that? How did they prepare that? Another thing you can do is look at history of the first settlers in your area. The first white settlers, for example, in your area. How did they live? How did they hunt? What crops did they grow? How did they grow those crops? How did they stay healthy? How did they treat their illnesses? How did they treat their sicknesses? How did they defend their homesteads? What animals, what domestic animals did they raise? What animals did they go out and hunt, and how did they hunt those? How did they use the meat and the resources that they got from those animals? You can go on further forward in history and look at the Great Depression in your area. How did your great-grandparents and grandparents survive during the Great Depression? What did they grow? How did they grow those foods? How did they keep healthy? What was the home remedies that they used that actually worked? What domestic animals did they raise the most, and how did they use those, preserve those? How did they can their canned goods? How did they do the things they did to stay alive? Another thing, for example, you can look at what they needed most. What if they had the things that if they had money on hand to go out and buy, or things they could barter for, what items did they go out and get? Those are the items that they couldn't make or grow where they are. So that will tell you what you need to stockpile more of. Like salt, for example, was very common for people to barter for and to need that they couldn't grow or get on their own property, because salt is a mineral that has to be mined. So salt is definitely one that most people have in common, most people during that time had in common, that they had to go out and buy or barter for. So look at everything in your area, the Native Americans, the first settlers, how people survived during the Great Depression, and try to figure out how they survived, how they used what they had, how they recycled what they had, how they grew, how they hunted, how they defended themselves. By finding out everything you can about those topics will help you better to plan your own survival and to actually prep and to actually survive. But the last person that I know that survived through the Great Depression was my grandfather on my dad's side. And he was a child during the time, but he remembered a lot about that. And he told me stories about how tough times were and how hard it was to survive. And they actually was on a farm, an 80-acre farm in Kentucky that they survived on. And they had chickens, they had hogs, they had some cattle, they had bees, and they raised huge gardens. They canned their own food, their own produce. So they survived pretty much off the land. They had to barter for a few items, and my great-grandfather, his main barter good was moonshine. He actually set up a still in the hills there out from his property, and he set up that moonshine still, and he would make that moonshine, and he would sell that and barter that for other things that he needed. So that right there is a lesson in and of itself, that no matter how hard times get, how difficult things are, people will still want to get plastered, and probably even more so because they want to forget about the world outside, about how hard times actually are. So they would barter for that moonshine, and that was his main barter item, his main skill, and the way he earned extra money to get the things that he couldn't grow or raise or harvest on their own property. So guys, the lesson here is to do a deep dive research into history of the local tribes that lived in your area, the first settlers that lived in your area, how people survived during the Great Depression, and see how they survived, and try to figure out how you can use what you learn to increase your own survival where you are. Anyways, guys, if you enjoyed the video, give it a big thumbs up. Thanks for watching. I'm the Creekmore. I'm out of here. I'll see you all in the next video, hopefully.